So we will, yes, we have got a quorum. We've counted already. Yep. Sina and Sarah have counted. We've got a quorum because we've got Rachel online. These guys have counted. Yep, we're good. Okay, you right? Okay. Right, so welcome back everybody to the Economic Growth Committee. We would like to welcome Bryce back for the item number 13 on page 169. Thank you, Bryce. We're just going to get going, Bryce.
Okay. Kia ora. Again, councillors. Vogel Street, so we went out and did some consultation on looking to make some safety improvements to Vogel Street. As the paper talks about, there was essentially broadly split into three areas: raised crossings, the Featherson Street intersection with Vogel Street, and then also some safety opportunities for cycleways that we could be implementing. Great news, we had really good levels of engagement around the project, and we also offered the opportunity for people to make suggestions and if there was any sort of improvements on what we could achieve, and pleasingly we also got quite a bit of feedback around that as well. In terms of where to from here, the raised crossings are a bit of a win-win. They're also quite easy to implement, and we'd be looking to implement them next financial year as part of the low cost, low risk program. The Featherson Street and Hayden intersection with Vogel requires a little bit more work. It's a very tight sort of dog leg of intersections there. We have budget in the first few years to be addressing that, although it does just need a bit of design work to be done. We may need to purchase a little bit of property, for instance, to make that done safely, because it is quite a tight turnaround, as I say, and quite a narrow road width to be playing with, to be adding turning lanes, turning bays rather. In terms of the cycleway work, excellent feedback. That is one area that does essentially came with the trade-offs in terms of street trees or on-site parking, for instance, were two of the major ones. Essentially, Vogel Street is a few streets. There's down the order, I guess, in terms of priorities to be doing cycleway improvements. Ahead of that was Featherson Street, Summerhill and Botanical, for instance. So we'd be proposing that we can readdress the cycleway improvements at a later date and work through those designs at that point. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Bryce. You got a good lot of feedback, so that's good. Let's start off with Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Bryce, what's the reasoning for not proceeding with any cycle improvements on Vogel Street? Is it because there wasn't a clear favourite from the feedback? Is it because we're just taking enough punishment about cycle lanes recently? What's the reasoning behind it?
There wasn't necessarily a clear favourite, so the opinion was divided. One of the suggestions that was made was around indenting car parking, so we could avoid, I guess that would help to mitigate not losing as many car parks on the side of the road, and also would hopefully avoid us cutting down many of the established trees, which was a real positive. Essentially, we have a budget through the LTP to be addressing cycleway safety improvements. Vogel Street is about fourth or fifth on that list, so it's not to say that we won't address that. It's more that there are some other higher priorities, probably in that pecking order. In particular, Botanical, for instance, is a road that comes to mind, and we often get feedback on.
So, have we sort of raised expectations that we might be making cycle improvements on Vogel and now we're not going to deliver on them?
That's a really good question, and that was one we talked about internally. I think the key message is we're not walking away from it and saying we're not going to. We're simply saying that all of the feedback we had will be used at the time, and essentially we'll be dealing with some of the high priority areas first.
Okay, I've just got one more question, Madam Chair, if that's okay. So we're going to be funding the race crossings through the low cost, low risk programme.
Correct.
Have we got enough budget in that programme?
Yes, we do. So both the raised crossings and also the Featherston Street intersection will be funded through that program. And there's currently proposed to be $8 million a year, I think, through that process, and a good $4 million of that each year is dealing with things like raised crossings and intersection improvements and the likes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Brush. Just wanted to pick up around time frame, noting that on screen there is an additional recommendation now. Your comments around the Featherston Street right-hand bay in terms of deliverability in FY25, is that challenging? Is it outright impossible? Is it what's the actual situation there?
It's not impossible. I guess I'm just highlighting it requires, it will require a little bit of design work, I guess, to get the best outcome we can. Originally, we were sort of proposing perhaps to do that in year 2, so we could definitely do the raised crossings. That's a win-win and easy work in terms of next year. Do the design work for the Featherston and Hayden intersection next year and then deliver it the following year. We could look to bring that forward. It's not impossible. I guess just looking to over-deliver, not under-deliver.
No, understood. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just on that, just to understand the complexity of what you're discussing in terms of design, I mean, raised crossings are physical infrastructure. This would just be lines on a road to add space for a right-hand turn bay, would be my understanding, or would it require a physical infrastructure treatment to enable that to happen? I'm just trying to understand what your concern is that it would take sort of 2 years to put in a turn bay.
Yeah, it's a good question. There could be some physical alterations. Essentially, you'd almost end up having to do back-to-back right turn bays. So you'd have one if you were heading towards Napier Road, say, turning right into Featherston Street. You would then equally have one if you were coming in the opposite direction, turning dead smack on the back of that to turn into Hayden Street. Currently, in both directions, you're stopping in the live lane. My reflection is I suspect we may need to try and purchase a little bit of property or reclaim some of the berms, for instance, to be able to do that safely, that it's going to allow the free flow outside of the right turn bays. And I'm not convinced at the moment that we can, of how simple that is.
Okay, thank you. My main question was on page 176. I see here that 24 did not support an option or supported / provided an alternative option. I was just wondering if you've got a breakdown there of those who didn't support an option at all versus those who provided an alternative. Just separating those out.
Yeah, not off the top of my head, no.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I've just got a question around the second recommendation that's there. In the report under 4.1, it's basically the same as that recommendation, I think, except for the time frame. The report says that will be implemented within the first 3 years of the LTP. If we progress with the recommendation 2 and bringing that just into the first year, I'm just wanting to know, are there any other programs that you consider would be higher, of higher importance or at higher risk that would be deferred if we progressed recommendation 2?
Because this will be coming out of low cost, low risk, that is dealing with raised crossings, intersection improvements, as I said. I'd previously circulated the list of raised crossings and the likes. Essentially, if council wanted these delivered in year one, we would just have to consider if any or how many of those might end up moving into, say, year two that we might have otherwise done in year one. I haven't done that analysis with the team yet to determine exactly what the trade-off would be.
So I guess what I'm wanting to understand is, so you must, I'm presuming you prioritise that work depending on what's the most urgent or most important. Where would this work fit in terms of that order of importance?
To be fair, both pieces of work were at relatively the top 10 in terms of that program of work anyway, in terms of work that we were looking to do. The raised crossings, as I said, we were planning on doing next year anyway, so that definitely is at the top of the list. The Featherston Street intersection is also towards the top of that list. As I said, my only hesitation to committing to it all being done in 1 year is just if there's some complexities that turn out through that design that might require, say, property to be purchased or something like that, that could take some time and that may impact deliverability. But I'm not really in a position to say either way whether that would or will not occur. It's not a budget issue, if that's the question.
And so if we progress the recommendation to and those issues occur that might need it to be extended, could you come back to us then and that be deferred as a result of that?
Absolutely.
Well, yeah.
Absolutely. And the design would be completed either way next year.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
Thank you, Bryce. That's all the questions. Right, I'll look to Councillor Barrett to talk to this recommendation.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, colleagues, and thanks, Bryce, for the report and acknowledgement around what's possible in terms of timeframes and some of the uncertainties around there. It was just about 2 years ago to the day that we had this petition brought to us from several hundred from memory, residents and people that regularly use Vogel Street and had significant concerns around the safety aspects there. And my reason for urgency, which I'll speak to first before speaking to the broader thing, is that, it's now 2 years on and we still have potentially a 3-year window that things could drift out in, and I'd much rather have us have a defined window of 12 months, and if it takes 13, it does, but really try to be as responsive as possible. I think we heard in terms of prioritization, this morning, quite a bit of that prioritization will happen after crashes have occurred. And it's really a mechanically driven thing, and I think that we as council are wise to ensure that prioritization includes community voice and that we're listening to community voice. And when we have a significant request, and I would consider this one a significant request, come to us, that we do give it every priority that we can. So the second recommendation is simply trying to do that, to ensure that as soon as possible we do have those 3 raised pedestrian crossings in Vogel Street, and that as soon as possible we have a right turn bay in the Featherston Street, Hayden Street area. So that's the intent. I'd ask for your support there. More broadly, I think it has been useful to have that broader conversation. I think there is the risk, as was alluded to in questions, that community expectation has been raised around cycleways coming in here, but I'm prepared to accept the officer's advice as admittedly somebody that always loves a good cycleway. I am prepared to take the officer's advice that there are other cycleways that we need to be keeping our focus on before getting into this particular part of the city in this way. So broadly comfortable with the feedback from that consultation or engagement process with the community. In the future, there will be a cycleway, I'm sure, in this part of the city, but it's not as an immediate future as some might have hoped. So we'll just acknowledge that and would ask for your support on both recommendations.
Thanks, everyone. Is everyone happy for them to go together? Okay, so we'll look to vote. Thank you. That's passed 12 votes for and none against. Thanks, everybody. We're now on to item number 14, which is Bryce again. And that is the 183. Bus shelters.
Kia ora again, councillors. Look, relatively, just trying to be transparent through this report, really. Essentially, the civil works engagement through Fulton Hogan is being delivered over a couple of stages, and really just wanted to bring it to council's attention around, I guess, the total size of those engagements through this chamber, especially since we haven't gone out to the market for procurement for both of these, as per a previous decision. Just as a bit of a broader update of where we're at in terms of this program. As of today, we've completed 15 new shelters in the city, and by the end of the year, we would have completed 49 out of the 82 new shelters. So all of the stops are now in place, and associated civil works. A big bit of the next 6 weeks or so in this program will be looking at things like indented bus bays and looking to make those kind of improvements. High on that priority list is Pioneer Highway and the several stops on that street which are currently in the live lanes. So we're looking to do some work around those. And then the remaining bus shelters after that will just slowly, progressively be rolled out through our existing programs. Until we've basically installed all 82 of the new stops. But essentially this piece of work is 90% funded by Waka Kotahi, and we have to have it completed by 30 June, which is what we're leaning for the line towards. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Bryce. Councillor Sibelin.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Bryce. This is just from a specific question that I was asked at the Ashurst LTP drop-in about whether all the stops are in place in Ashurst currently, even if the shelters are not in train.
All of the stops are now in place. Some of them are destined to have future shelters, which, as I said, are still underway, but the stops are definitely there. And a correction to my earlier comment, good news, this is actually 100% funded by NZTA, not 90%.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Naylor.
Thanks, Bryce. Just looking at the table under 1.8 on page 184, the budget and the reforecast at the bottom are exactly the same. I was just interested in the top one, the project management, which is internal capitalised labour cost. Just what would be the driver of that being an increase on budget?
When we were originally setting the budgets for this at a high level, there was a number of moving parts to it. Horizons hadn't yet formalised their routes, for instance. There was a degree of uncertainty around exactly what needed to be done, and we'd taken as a rule of thumb, internal costs, contract management, project management and the likes is about 10% of a project typically, and that was the rule of thumb we used, 500 out of a $5.3 million budget. We're now in a position where we can provide some more accurate costings, which is reflected in the second column. So it's not the fact that it's necessarily gone up, it's more that it's actually accurate details as opposed to just a blob of $500,000.
So are you suggesting staff there that they on this project or something to determine that, or?
Absolutely. So all of our staff time that is related to this project, whether it be consultation with the public through the hearings that we were doing when people are doing objections, through to actually managing the contract and getting things delivered, all of that time is being captured within the project.
So because both of the amounts at the bottom are exactly the same, are there, how do I put this, are there numbers that are adjusted to make that equal the same, or is that just coincidence?
No, we have a total budget envelope that we have to play with, which is $5.35 million. That was the funding that came from Waka Kotahi. And basically we need to stay within that. So we've adjusted figures accordingly. When we have some actuals, such as the detailed design, which is complete, and the project management, we have adjusted some of the other figures accordingly to make the number work. So we also have exact numbers for shelter procurement and construction management. So really it came down to how much of the civil work we could do as part of this engagement was the moving part.
Okay, thank you.
Right, finally, Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just thought I'd take this opportunity. I got asked the other week what was happening to our existing shelters, and I recall being assured that they would be repurposed onto other routes. I just wanted to get an update on how that program's going, and if that's included in this contract or is being funded separately.
Yes, that is definitely the intention. As long as the shelter being removed is structurally, sound and it is actually fit for purpose, then the intention is to be reusing those in a whole variety of areas. The majority of the work today has been focused on getting the new network operating, so we've been focusing on filling in the gaps, the bus stops, putting in shelters for those new stops. A lot of that repurposing of existing shelters will come in the next year or so.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bryce. That's all the questions. Happy to move this recommendation that we note that the total value of the civil work and engagement with Wilton Hogan to support the bus shelter improvement project is 1.495500 excluding GST, and that the council note that the bus shelter improvement works have been directly awarded to Wilton Hogan through separate work packages to ensure successful delivery of the overall projects within the required timeframes as specified through the Transport Choices Funding Agreement, moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Wood. Thank you. There are no comments, so we will look to vote. Is everybody in? Are you ready, Paul? That's 12 votes for and none against. Everybody? Right, moving to item 15. Finally, you, Stacey. On page 187. Our economic performance.
Kia ora tātou, I'm Stacey Andrews, City Economist. I do have a presentation for you today. I realise there's a lot of detail within the reports that you've been provided, so I've tried to summarise the main points for you, but happy to take questions because there is a huge amount of detail. Just wait for that presentation to come through. Plugged in.
I think you need to tidy up your desktop.
Oh, can you see my desktop? Oh gosh. Should be up there. Is it coming through? It's on my screen. Sorry, Sam. Apologies. It's on my screen. It's been from the start. Okay, that's looking more promising. Okay, here we go. Apologies for that. Okay, so economic update. The economic update includes 3 different reports. The first one is the economic growth indicators for the latest growth indicators that we have in terms of information. The second report is a city snapshot. So that's a new one that we have developed since the last committee meeting where we were asked to have a look at how we compare to other cities. And then the electronic card spending report, which is prepared in-house and provided to Palmy Bid for their information. And we've been presenting that to Council for about the last year as useful information. So it's been a really solid 5 years for the city economy. Our GDP has increased by 13.4% relative to New Zealand. Investment as well as our economic structure has really supported that activity relative to the national story. Wider economic challenges, however, are now weighing on economic activity. And as you can see, over the year to December, our GDP fell by 0.5% relative to a 0.7% increase across New Zealand. The economic activity is slowing by design. The RBNZ has pushed up interest rates to slow the New Zealand economy to get on top of inflation. So it's nothing that's happening or being generated from Palmerston North particularly. It's a national and international story. It is tough times for our businesses and our households as they really have to shut their wallets to ride through this period of higher costs. On the upside, the efforts of the RBNZ to rein in inflation are really working now, and we can see that inflation rate coming down. It was 4% over the year to March. There are some issues around domestic inflation, which has been particularly sticky and stickier than they would like, so that is remaining higher than they would like, which may delay rate declines or reductions. However, all forecasts at the moment still point towards a reduction in the OCR toward the end of 2024 or early 2025. I don't think the full force of the economic slowdown has been shown yet within our data. I think right now things are actually harder out there than what we're seeing in this data. So we're moving through the period and we will come out the other side. The economic structure of Palmerston North does continue to buffer the highs and lows, and we see that over the long term in terms of GDP, that we don't have the highs and lows that many other places have, partly because of our quite diverse economic base, but also our large public sector employment as well, and in particular defence and health that are least exposed to changes in government policy, etc. Our longer term investment actually continues to look very positive, and our building consents, especially in non-residential construction, is very strong, and that's a mixture of both industrial and commercial, particularly industrial and public investment in the city. So none of this is surprising in terms of GDP declining. As we can see here, over 61% of GDP is actually generated from private consumption. So when our households are doing it tough from increasing prices, then our businesses are doing it tough too. So that's what we're seeing now. And again, as I said, this is what the RBNZ did want to see to bring those interest rates down toward the end of the year. High inflation and high interest rates have reduced spending across the economy. I don't want to repeat myself, so a lot of this I've already talked about. The New Zealand dollar relative to the USD is quite low at the moment. It has popped up above 59 over the last few days, but generally around the 58, 59, which is supporting our exporters, but also increases the price that we pay for goods coming into the country. So there's that other impact as well. One of our biggest factors at the moment is international conditions. We're really at the mercy of both domestic and international conditions that we have no control over whatsoever. So I think when I wrote this report, Treasury yields were coming down. Now they're going up again because of the strength of the US dollar. So we're seeing those kind of international forces playing out here in New Zealand as well, with longer term interest rates looking like they're going to stay higher for a bit longer. Domestic inflation coming down, though, should support lower interest rates within New Zealand in terms of the OCR. So another interesting phenomenon, of course, is that all these factors are weighing on mortgage lending as well. But if we see in this graph, it's actually starting to tick up again. So we are seeing the housing market showing some signs of recovery. It's relatively slow, but there is an increase in supply and turnover of houses in the city and both nationally. Interesting, when I was talking to the Bailey's owner on Tuesday night last week, she was saying also that investors are starting to come back into the market. And we know that from the 1st of April, the deductibility of interest was reintroduced, the 80% this year, moving up to 100% next year. And we're hoping that that will bring some investors back into the market, if anything, mainly because we need the supply of houses for our communities. Very important. Business and jobs data has been quite mixed. 8,138 businesses in the city. The year before we had very strong growth in businesses, so this is sort of like a stabilisation. There has been growth across New Zealand of 1.1%. Non-residential construction investment, very strong, up 42.7% relative to a 4% increase across New Zealand. So we're seeing a lot of health sector investment in the city. We're seeing Defence Force investment. We're seeing a lot of industrial investment in terms of warehousing in particular. And we're also, so a lot of public and private investment is actually bolstering that. So it's not all public sector. There's a lot of industrial investment in there as well. Field jobs are a bit mixed. So in terms of place of residence, we've had an increase of 2%. But at the workplace location, it's down 2.7%. I can't give you an answer right now as to why that's happening. There is a big margin of error on this data. However, it doesn't include self-employment, so it is just wages, wage earners, salary earners as at that date. So we'll be keeping an eye on that to see if we can see tangible signs of a decline of employment in the city. We are seeing some loosening of the labour markets. Unemployment rate has ticked up to 4.4. That's relative to 3.7 New Zealand. Percent across New Zealand. Still low by historical standards, but we're definitely seeing the increase in unemployment there. And the changes in the MSD job seeker numbers are up 11.1% versus 11.6% for New Zealand. And that's a national phenomenon. We're seeing that everywhere. I've just put this slide up quickly to show what our non-residential construction is, the components of our non-residential construction. So as you can see, prior to 2018, our levels were quite low, but we've seen quite strong activity since then, and 2020 to January 2024 was no exception. So that's really helping to provide some support to our economy at this time when other factors are contracting activity. Job seeker benefits rise across all age groups. Again, this is a national phenomenon. We're seeing it everywhere. I will say that within our job seeker data, we also have sickness beneficiaries within that as well. And over half of the increase is actually in sickness beneficiaries, people who are not able to work right now. I am hoping that that they will actually take that data out so we can monitor the work-ready job seekers with more accuracy, because it can be quite misleading at times, this data. The earnings growth, 10% over the year to December 2023 in the city versus 9.5% for New Zealand. Very strong growth and driven by those tight labour market conditions in 2023. So the biggest challenge for businesses in 2023 was getting staff. Now that's changed to demand conditions, so there's more concern about that now. But when we see those tight labour market conditions and contest or competition for labour, we see those strong increases. We also had a lot of public sector wage agreements over that period of time as well, which did drive up those figures. Median earnings from salaries and wages, this data is only to the year ended December 2022, and it does exclude self-employment, but it's very accurate. The more recent data is not so robust, so I do refer to this as well. But that's starting to show some of those increases that we saw from the tight labour market conditions, with median earnings up 6.4% versus 7.5% for New Zealand. Labour cost index up 4.3 over the year to December. That's actually come down a bit. Private sector 3.9 and public sector 5.7. Again, in the public sector, that was very much driven by those wage agreements that we saw, large-scale wage agreements across different industries in the public sector. Earnings growth is expected to ease in 2024 alongside easing inflation and labour market conditions. And although earnings growth is great for people, especially when inflation is very high, it did put a lot of pressure on businesses to keep up with those increases, to keep their staff over that period of time. So bringing it down to a more moderate level alongside inflation is a positive in terms of the economic cycle. Housing market indicators are relatively positive for the city. Kaunga-Ora is contributing quite a bit to our new dwelling consents, of which we're seeing quite strong activity there. We estimate there's been 116 consents issued for KO over that time, which is helping our public housing sector. One of our standouts is our housing affordability, which we can see is We're very affordable compared to a lot of other places, which also shows in the city snapshot, which is here. So in terms of the city snapshot, we rank very well on housing affordability, rental affordability, school attendance and commercial vehicle registrations. So we bucked the trend a bit on commercial vehicle registrations, where we actually saw an increase versus a 20.8% fall nationally. So that shows that there's still some confidence within our commercial sector to spend on those big ticket items. Car registrations are down across the country and there's no difference here. Non-residential consents up 45.5%. Oh, actually that's in the wrong place. Versus 21.7. So these are averages across the other cities that we're looking at. Non-residential consents in places like New Plymouth were very, very strong, so higher than here. One other thing that's quite positive for the city is that our NEET rate is quite low relative to many other places and comparable cities across New Zealand at 11.8%. All the other indicators are what we would expect. Employment place of residence is a little lower here at 1.6% versus 2.1% New Zealand. But we do have some real standouts in terms of our performance in comparison to other cities. So spending highlights from the retail spending report. So our spending increased 3%, which was below the rate of inflation over that period of time, which was 4.7%. 56% of our total spend is in the central city. Accommodation in the city centre actually increased really strongly over the year, but that was also compared to a year when when we had restrictions on accommodation and activity in that sense. But we are seeing that increase there. As expected, home and recreational, retail and other consumer spending, so our discretionary spending types, are the ones that we're seeing fall as people focus on paying for core goods and services across the community. So it's that discretionary spending that's really seeing the hit in terms of the contraction of the economy. Spending on groceries and liquor. Liquor is only a very small proportion, so it's predominantly groceries, was the highest dollar growth, and that was up 8.6%. And this is nominal data, so it doesn't include the impact of inflation. Actually, on a positive note, our food prices fell 0.5% between February and March, so we're seeing those food prices come back into expectation, I guess, and not have the 13.5–14% rises that we saw the year before. Cafes, restaurants and bars spending has increased in the city, but they are under a lot of pressure. That is comparing it to a year when cafes were shut or there was restrictions on cafes. So even though it's increasing, we understand that they are under a lot of pressure because people aren't going out and spending money as much as what they previously were. Our loyalty rates in the city are really high compared to a lot of other places at 81.6%. So 81.6% of spending here is done by locals, which is really, really positive. Net flows into the city are also positive, so more is coming in than what is going out. So that is generally positive and continues to be. So economic outlook, I probably said most of this, so I won't repeat myself, but yeah, basically writing out 2024 is the theme. What we really need to see is the inflation, especially domestic inflation, start to come down and provide confidence to the Reserve Bank that interest rates can be lowered. That will release money or resources to households so they can go out and spend again across the economy. At the moment, that is the biggest barrier in terms of business activity or economic activity. So it is a hard time for many people, but we can see now that there is light at the end of the tunnel in terms of moving through that cycle and moving on to lower interest rates. And this is my final slide. This is just the investment outlook. We haven't had any indication thus far that any of this is going to change. We're still keeping an eye on it strongly, and we will update once the LTPs have been finalised for both councils. But currently, we're not aware of any changes to the big ticket investment that we know is coming into the city. Right, that's all from me. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Stacey. It's a very comprehensive report. We have got questions, so we'll start off with Councillor Naylor.
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. You mentioned, tough times for households and people needing to shut their wallets. What's the best metric to look at to see whether that's improving? Would it be the GDP and consumer spending, or what?
I always first and foremost, actually like to talk to people in the community because they see it before we do in the data, but definitely consumer spending is one that really reflects, I guess, the sentiment of consumers. Plus, we look at consumer sentiment surveys from across New Zealand and try and hone in on data for our general area to see the sentiment. The other one is employment levels.
Okay. And so those ones that you've mentioned do seem to be worse here locally than the average across New Zealand. Do you know why? Do you have any understanding of why that might be?
Yes, we're not particularly exposed to tourism here in the city, so the national average is including those parts, those areas across New Zealand that are getting a boost from tourism picking up again after the pandemic. So yeah, that's really the main reason for that difference.
And so just looking at consumer spending on your city snapshot one, on page 198, we're obviously a bit lower than New Zealand, but looking across at New Plymouth with 19%, do we have any understanding why, you know, we've been compared to New Plymouth recently, but clearly we're not, our people aren't spending as much as what they're spending up there?
I actually don't, I'm sorry, but I did notice that myself and thought I must find out. So I'm quite keen to find out why that is, whether or not they were hit particularly hard during the pandemic period, and that's coming off a low base. Although looking at the industry structure, you wouldn't think so particularly. It could be domestic tourism, but I will have a look into that.
Yeah. And just the final question was, the last slide you, in your presentation, had PNCC's investment in infrastructure at 1.3 billion. Is that over what period of time?
This was for the 2021-2031 LTP. I am going to update this once the LTPs for both the Manawatu district and ourselves have been completed.
So is that a 10-year forecast for all of the sectors in there?
Yes, yeah, capital.
Lovely.
Yeah.
As in capital new or capital, all of capital?
All of capital, I believe.
Yeah, lovely, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Zebellin.
Thanks, Stacey. I just had some questions about the carbon intensity, and that you'd noted emissions, gross emissions had fell 5% and net emissions down 4.2%. Is that comparable to the national reduction?
I can answer this question. It is for the next report.
Okay.
But I've actually invited Senior Climate Change Advisor David Watson along to help me with any technical questions around that. But I haven't presented. I can answer it now if that's what you want.
Should we save that for the next report?
Yep, absolutely. And I just had one other question, is that's gross emissions excluding forestry. I'm just wondering, why do we exclude forestry? Is that data captured separately?
We do both. So we have calculations, gross emissions and also net emissions that take into consideration forestry. So we do have both.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Apologies, I tapped the microphone, turned myself off. Thanks, Stacey. Just a question around the number of new dwelling consents. So I see that you've taken out, well, not taken out, but, you let us know the amount that were Kainga Ora. But do we know how many of those are the relocatable dwellings that will be moved out of the city?
We do track that, but it's not included in this data set. So I can get that information for you.
So when you say it's not included, would that be on top of the 468 consents? Or
no, I do believe that is included in the 460.
Okay, so they're in the 460, but we just don't know how many of them there are.
We do hold that information. The problem for us when we're comparing across other places is that we can't get the number of relocates for that area, so we tend to use total building consents. We have to look into our own building consent records manually to understand which are relocates and which are not. Yeah. It's a really good one for Stats New Zealand actually to start publishing a series that is net of relocates that come outside the city.
Yeah, I mean, because we know how many new residential dwellings we need per year, but if we don't know how many are being relocated outside the city, it's hard to interpret the data as to whether we're meeting that.
Yeah, our planning department also is tracking net increase in dwellings now as well. So I think I'll bring that along in future as a supplementary. We can't compare it with other places because we haven't got access to their detailed building consent records, but we can certainly bring that along as supplementary information.
Okay, so would you be able to just email us with how many of those were relocatable?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Councillor Barrett?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Stacey, for the quarterly report and the city's snapshot. Just had a question around that kind of selection of comparator cities, and is that kind of a set of cities that just come stock standard, or do we end up deciding what goes in there?
I looked at a whole lot of locations across New Zealand trying to find a city that was just like ours, and there isn't one. Yeah. So I deferred to the MP's, the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, and their identification of Tier 2 cities. So that was how I identified those. I did take out Queenstown because, again, they're very different to us, and Tasman and Nelson. But, yeah, that was how I selected those cities.
That's great. It's easy to figure out why they weren't like us for the best. So I just wondered, is there scope to think about a bit more diversity there, understanding that you're wanting to operate in Tier 2, but, I would assume that there's a reasonable amount of linkage between the Hastings and the Napier economy. And when we're not seeing an economy out of the Waikato, we're not seeing an economy out of the top of the South, I'm trying to understand why we would kind of double down on two quite linked economies in the Hawke's Bay and have no visibility in the Waikato or Nelson.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. This report is evolving, so we can modify it. At the moment, it's sort of in the development phases, but I thought I'd bring it along to show you what it's like, but we can look at that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. There's no further questions. Thanks, Stacey. I'd like to move that the committee receive the following report. The Palmy Economic Growth Committee indicators April 24, that the city snapshots December 2023, and that the city Palmerston North electric card spending report December quarter 2023 presented to the Economic Growth Committee for today, and that's moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Wood. I just want to say it's a fantastic report. Well done for all the effort you put into it, and you did a great presentation to us today. So thank you very much, Stacey, for all the effort you put into that today. There's no further comment on that, so hold my breath. We've got the Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Apologies for lateness coming back in. I just caught the tail end of Councillor Johnson's questions, and look, I believe that that figure is quite large around the transportable homes, so it is something we probably need to check. I think it's in the vicinity of around 90. So that does skew the numbers a little bit. So it would be something great that Stacey perhaps included into that whole, I suppose, dwellings or consent mix of what is KO and what is our transportable home sector, and that may even get larger with the new factory that's being built. You'll see that large structure as you go over the overbridge. It's Rangitikei line, and that's the Presidential Homes business there. But they do some great work, but of course a lot of it goes outside the city. But look, thanks to Stacey, I really like the city snapshot. It's something we've missed for a while. We used to get the core cities data, where we, and I suppose going to where Councillor Barrett was speaking, where we were compared with Hamilton, Dunedin, Queenstown and the metros. It was quite useful because it did sort of see where there was some good stuff happening and perhaps where there's some gaps we could plug. I'm aware that there may be some work happening from some of the other cities around that space, so it'd be great if you could connect in with that somehow, because I think that data already exists. It's a matter of just aligning it next to ours with the same sort of, I suppose, scope of what we're trying to measure. But no, really, it was really interesting to see where things are around regional New Zealand. But I agree. I think there's some other cities we could be marking against as well. So thank you. That's good.
Thank you, Councillor Naylor.
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly, I just wanted to say I think this report is really useful and certainly confirms what we're hearing our community say to us. Particularly the city snapshot is really useful, I think, like others have mentioned, particularly looking at the GDP, seeing that the average for New Zealand is positive, but then seeing us in other cities that are in the negative. It would be kind of useful to understand which cities or are sort of driving that average positive, just to better understand where we sit. But yeah, really useful information, so thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Let's now vote. It's passed 11 for and none against. Someone not voted? Oh, Billy didn't vote. Okay, thank you, Billy. Okay, we'll now look to item number 16. Thank you, Stacey. So that's on page 213. Thank you. The structure summary report.
Kia ora again. Just getting the right presentation up. So thank you for the opportunity to present the Palmerston North Economic Structure Report. This report, the timeline for this is March 2023. The information that we use to populate this report is the very detailed lead data and Infometrics GDP data that we get at 504 industry level. So it is a little bit out of date, but it's the most detailed, robust data that we can access. Okay, so I'll put this one up again just to show how our economic structure is supporting economic activity in the city, especially over the last 5 or so years. Economic structure, as we've talked about many times, the diverse public sector supported by defence and health. Defence and health are far less exposed to changing policy decisions, especially at the moment. So that does provide some robustness to our economy relative to many other places. It's not to say that there won't be impacts from restructuring of the public sector. It's just that a substantial proportion of our public sector is less vulnerable to those changes, which relative to other places is a benefit. We have a very high value public and private industry with an eye to the future, so our research industry is going from strength to strength, and we see that in the data every year. It is strengthening more and more. And I think we're very focused on that as a city, as well as our research institutes, etc. So that is a real benefit in terms of technology that will further some of our big industries like food production, etc. So it really helps to support the diversity and the strength of our city economy. We have a very high proportion of our workforce that are in highly skilled and skilled roles. So we have that high value industry here, which again is a benefit for us. Economic growth, we know that economic growth is under pressure over the short term, but over the long term things are looking pretty positive. We do have that diverse industry and public and industrial investment, and even in this period of time we're still continuing to see our big businesses actually looking to the future and investing at this time, large warehousing, etc., our logistics and distribution sector, we're seeing that investment coming in. Our profile here in terms of the size of our businesses is significantly larger than the New Zealand average. So we have more people employed in larger businesses than a lot of New Zealand, and they are less vulnerable to these economic cycles that we're seeing at present. So GDP structure, again, our public sector is very large compared to a lot of other places. So GDP structure there compared with the national, which is 23.1% of the national GDP is from our health, government and education sectors. So we have that strength there. Public administration and safety, 704.4 million, so that is our biggest sector. Healthcare and social assistance, 594 million. Wholesale trade again is another one. It had a bit of a downturn over 2023 for obvious reasons really, after the boom times of 2022, and then did slow again a little bit in 2023. But again, the future looks very bright for that one. Rental, hiring and real estate is a big industry in the city, and construction was large as well, but also had contracted from the previous year. So the highest growth sectors were the rental, hiring and real estate services. That was basically due to the house price boom that we saw in the earlier part of that March 2023 year. So the return to property or to capital was very strong over that period. Healthcare and social assistance, we saw some recovery in our healthcare and social assistance sector, which had been quite deprived of resources when the borders were closed, so that was positive. As I was saying, around our professional, scientific and technical services, we see this growth year on year in that sector. So it is really important for our city to see those high-end, high-quality services expanding in that way. Transport, postal and warehousing, which is again part of our logistics and distribution sector, is also growing quite strongly, and admin and support services. And interestingly enough, it was business cleaning services that grew the most within that one, which I found quite interesting. Employment structure, healthcare and social assistance, our largest employer. Education and training, again, very large employer. Although our higher education sector is under pressure at the moment, it still remains our 5th largest sector in terms of what we call level 7 industry. So out of 504 level 7 industries, it's still the 5th biggest industry within our cities. So it's still very important. Public admin and safety, again, one of our biggest. Construction, very labour intensive, and retail trade, of course. Now, manufacturing increased over the year to March 2023, and that was a period of time where there was quite a lot of demand globally for our products. We expect that that would have come away since then with the downturn globally in demand for goods and services. So information next year will provide us with more insight into what the changes have been there. Again, construction after the boom period has now eased off a bit, with employment down 131. Rental, hiring, real estate services, similar in the sense that house prices have fallen and demand has fallen in that sense. Professional, yeah, again, so another high growth sector in terms of employment as well, and transport, postal and warehousing, which again is part of our logistics and distribution sector. We have seen some downturn in some industries, and some are structural and some are just temporary as we go through that downturn. The one I would point out is around the media, information, media and telecommunications, which we're seeing a steady decline in both across New Zealand and within Palmerston North City. Some of the reasons for that is technology taking over, and also alternative media, people accessing alternative media. Yes, so that's some of the reasons for that, and technology taking the place of actual employees on the ground. So that's a national and probably a global phenomenon as we move forward. So employment by occupation, professionals are by far our largest sector with over 15,500 people employed in that sector. Managers second, community and personal service workers third, and technician and trade workers fourth, and clerical and admin workers fifth. So quite a diverse, but also a highly skilled structure there, with professionals making up the lion's share, making up the biggest percentage. We have 18,928 people employed in knowledge-intensive industries as well. Highest growth areas are professionals, with health professionals, in particular midwifery and nurses, making up the lion's share of that. Machinery operations and drivers, truck drivers was a big growth area, and at the presentation last Tuesday night we had members of the logistics and distribution sector there who talked about the boom times and the demand for truck drivers over that period. Managers, business and administration was a big growth area over the year as well. So carbon emissions. So this data set has been calculated from our citywide inventory, which Senior Advisor David Watson looks after, and then we've compared that with the GDP data for the calendar years of which the carbon relates to. So from this information we can see that our carbon emissions per $1 million of GDP is actually declining over time. From the information that I was provided, most of that is being generated from the way that we generate electricity at the national level. So there's been a decline in coal generation, an increase in renewables, in particular hydro generation. So that's a national phenomenon that we're seeing there, but it's really benefiting the emissions that are being generated from our city as well. We don't have perfect information on that. We're still working through different ways of, in particular, assessing what the impact of our own actions are at the local level. We don't have a huge amount of information on that yet, but I'm sure if you have any more tricky questions that David Watson can give you the details of that during the question time. I did run some numbers around the national data today, and although I haven't had them scrutinised or verified it yet, but it does look like these are a little bit higher than ours. Gross emissions but per $1 million of GDP a little bit higher, but I'd just like to get those scrutinised and confirmed before I bring those back to you. Business survival trends are down in the city, as we can see there. The reasons for this, there would be multiple of them. Some of the reasons would be 2020 was a period where people were setting up their own businesses to manage the impacts of COVID-19, etc. So I believe that would be having an impact, but we don't know for sure. So we will, as the data comes out every year, we will bring that back with more insights into the trends that we are seeing. Interestingly, looking at the business survival rates across industries, public administration safety has a 100% survival rate, of course, which, yeah, is probably quite obvious. But some of the ones that we see lower survival rates are in our professional, scientific and technical services and in our administration support services. And often people set themselves up as sole traders or set themselves up as a business, a single person as a business, and we see quite a lot of volatility in those industries. But again, as more information comes through over the period 2021-22 and survival rates over the 3 years, we'll have more insights into why that is happening across the city economy. Yeah, business size, we've talked about this, but it's substantially higher than the national average business size, and the big end of town, having those big businesses in the city, it does boost our resilience because they are more resilient, less vulnerable to those economic cycles. Not saying they're completely immune to it, but they are less vulnerable and can ride out those hard times a bit easier than SMEs, etc. So industry outlook, economic structure has proven supportive during this period of disruption. There's always disruption, but this has been particularly disrupted the last 4 years. Defence and healthcare sector is less vulnerable, so that's been a real benefit for our city. Big business adds to the sustainability, as we've discussed. Disruption of some industries, such as information, media and telecommunications, will no doubt continue. It's not related to the economic cycle as such. It's more technological advancement and different consumption of consumers. But there are industries that are going through a bit of a tough time at the moment due to the downturn in consumer spending and demand, but it's just a cycle. They will recover from that. Wholesale trade, retail trade are two of those in particular that we're just going through cyclic contraction at the moment. Inflation returning to range and easing monetary policy will support business activity, and we expect to move back toward the middle of the range early next year. So we should see interest rates, but the OCR in particular, start to come down toward the end of this year or early next year. Any questions?
Thank you, Stacey. Councillor Naylor.
Thanks, Stacey. Just one question from me. The first slide on your presentation, and it's also the graph on page 220 here, shows the Palmerston North GDP being higher than New Zealand average, I think.
Oh, sorry, I'll just look at it.
It's got Palmerston North, the growth, plus 13%, New Zealand 11%.
Yes, that's the 5-year growth. Yes.
5-year growth.
Cumulative growth.
So on in the previous item, the snapshot showed us being lower than the New Zealand average, us being minus 0.5% and New Zealand being plus 0.7%. So has that shifted, or am I just not understanding the data?
Both figures are correct. Yeah. So in the figure 1 on page 220, as we can see toward the end of that time series, we start to see the slope of that line coming down for Palmerston North City, so that's showing a bit of a decline from what was, from our growth rate previously, whereas New Zealand's coming down a little bit there too, so theirs is eased as well. But the 13.4% is over the 5 years. Looking at the slope of the graph at different times, we've seen very strong, almost vertical growth at times, and now it's flattening down and starting to come down. So the 0.5% over the year to December is just reflecting that easing toward the end of that time period. Does that make sense?
Yep, so is it that this data is older than the snapshot?
This one here, the first graph within the first graph within the structure report is till December 2023, so it is the same data from the snapshot as well. The rest of this report is based on the detailed lead data, etc., to March 2023, but the first one is based on the latest growth figures that we have over the 5 years.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks again, Stacey. A couple questions in this one. I was interested in that kind of high-skilled workforce stuff that you're talking about, and I think the thing that I heard probably when I came to New Zealand in 2000 was that we had the highest number of PhDs per capita. I'm just wondering kind of how often that data gets revalidated or retested, and is that still true for the city?
Are you referring to greenhouse gas emissions per capita?
No, sorry, PhDs per capita.
Oh, PhDs per
Clearly not articulating well enough.
It is my belief that that was the case around 4 years ago. I haven't retested the information. I do believe that that information comes from the census. So when that information comes out, I can update you on that.
Cool, thanks. Did have some questions about emissions intensity. Really just firstly to understand, do we have any data that kind of goes back before the 2018, or like have we reached is there data before 2018?
I will call on Mr. David Watson to answer that question, if that's right.
Good afternoon, councillors. David Watson, Senior Climate Change Advisor. So from a national perspective, we do have data going back to the early 90s in terms of like national emissions inventory data, but we've only been compiling a citywide emissions inventory for Palmerston North since 2018.
Right. So we can't really make any inference then before 2018?
Not accurately.
Yeah,
We could compare it to national data and assume the trends would be similar, but not really.
And thinking about the kind of confounding effect of the emissions intensity of the grid, is there in future ways that we could kind of pull the grid emissions intensity out of this so we could kind of understand actually the stuff that's within our grasp a little bit more as a city and those trends as opposed to things that are just kind of washing across the whole nation?
Statistically, it's possible to do. A lot of what you might call the changes that we can influence would be improving the efficiency of buildings and operations, so that has an impact on electricity use. So I don't think you can completely separate out the emissions factor from how the electricity is generated and the usage information. But it might be possible to find out, to determine that in sort of kilowatt hours used, and then extract that away from the emissions factor of the carbon, or potentially use a 5-year rolling emissions factor rather than the year by year to even out those changes.
Yeah. Cool, thanks for those perspectives. And finally, just wanted to understand on the financial side, Stacey, around once we get to kind of 10 and 20-year data, are those real data, i.e. have they been inflation adjusted?
Yes, those data sets are real GDP.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Madam Chair.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. Thanks, Stacey. I just wondered if there was much change in the structure since the last time this was done. So in other words, the top 5, say, areas of economic contribution, are they still the same? Has the structure of the economic snapshot, I suppose, changed much in the last few years?
Yes, but not significantly. So we've got some cyclic changes in the sense that, for example, our construction sector has come off the peak, so it's not the third highest anymore. It's very minor stuff. The one thing that we are seeing in terms of the percentage of economic activity, information, media and telecommunications, as I've mentioned, has definitely reduced. Our education sector is still very strong, but it is reducing over time. It's something, it's one of our largest industries by far. So we are seeing a little bit of a change in the proportions of GDP and employment contribution, but nothing major or structural at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry, through the chair, if I could just add, the one that we are seeing significant growth in is definitely our logistics and distribution sector. So structurally, that's becoming more important to the Palmerston North economy.
Thank you.
Thank you, councillor. Thank you, Stacey. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
That's all the questions that we've got today. I'd like to move that the committee receive the report titled Palmerston North Economic Structure Summary Report 2023, Attachment 1, presented to the Economic Growth Committee on the 24th of April 2024, moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Wood. Again, a great report in highlighting structures and industries for the city to look at. So thank you very much for that, Stacey. There is no other comments in the queue, so we'll just look to vote. Thank you, everyone. That has passed, votes for and none against. The item is item number 19, and that's on page 321, which is the work schedule. I'll just ask Mr. Murphy if he's got anything he wants to comment on.
No comment, Madam Chair.
Okay, I'd like to move that, and seconded by Councillor Wood, and we'll vote on the work schedule. That's passed 12 votes and none against. I'd like to close the meeting at 3:22 on Wednesday afternoon and hand over to the Mayor. Oh, sorry. We're going to first off close with a karakia from Councillor Zabellan.
Ngā mihi i te tiamana. Me inoi tātou. Whakatakatehau ki te uru, whakatakatehau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hia ki ana te ātākura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu. Tihei, mauri ora. Thank you.
All right, we'll do our events forum from here. We have another meeting